Welcome to Video Game Genres, where your host Gexup provides you information you need to know about a certain number of video games put in a category. And tonight's episode of Video Game Genre is Cinematic Platformers. One of the most familiar video game genres that anyone can easily identify are 2D platformers. It doesn't take a genius to see one, as it is a simple game style that consists on controlling a character from getting to point A to B as the main object of the game. But not all 2D platformers play the same, yet there are traditional point A to B platformers, Metroidvania, a non-linear 2D action-adventure, puzzle platformers, and many more. They all consist on moving fast, making high and long jumps, and still be able to move into the direction when falling, and jumping on enemies' heads, or various other attacks to defeat enemies. This is an awesome genre, but there are snobby gamers whom seek for quote-unquote realistic games that overlooks 2D platformers, claiming that it's for kids. What they don't know is that not all 2D platformers play the same. There is one 2D platformer subgenre that distinct from being typical platform games in that they focus on fluid, lifelike movements without the exaggerated physics found in nearly all other platform games. That 2D platformer subgenre is cinematic platformers. So where did cinematic platformers begin? Well, they've begun way before the Nintendo Entertainment System saved the gaming industry in the 80s. It's hard to say which game actually started this subgenre, and my research hasn't given out details on what was the very first one that innovated this concept. But the earliest roots from where this subgenre begun was on the Commodore 64 and the Amiga that had games like Weird Dreams, Karateka, Impossible Mission, and Project Firestart that weren't all exactly platformers, but they were indeed cinematic, and the earliest games that took the fluid, lifelike movements that later cinematic platformers uses. But one of the first games to stand out as one of the first cinematic platformer that gave this subgenre a future was Prince of Persia, originally released for the Apple II on October 3rd, 1989. It was later ported to other systems in order for it to be more successful. But what Jordan Mechner, the developer of the game, wanted was to have realistic animation and movements and fluid gameplay than his other game before Prince of Persia, which was Karateka. Mechner videotaped and photographs his younger brother David walking, running, jumping, falling, landing, and many other movements when developing Prince of Persia to make it realistic. So basically, this is one of the earliest games that uses real-life people to develop a video game. Prince of Persia became a huge success and made a huge legacy. Then a French game developer named Eric Chahi, working for Delphine Software, was heavily inspired by the Amiga version of Dragon's Lair, and he wanted to make a game more diverse than Prince of Persia, Karateka, and Impossible Mission combined. It took Chahi 2 years to develop his big upcoming game. Then in 1991, he finally released Another World, also known as Out of This World in North America. The game brought the concept of what was from Prince of Persia and made it into a brand new level by making the game to have an epic storyline with a young physicist named Lester Knight Shaken, and have a heavily narrative adventure where he's transported to a different dimension and must journey on to find his way home, encountering dangerous situations, and requires quick thinking and reaction in order to survive. Another World was a major technical achievement where many critics praised for its atmospheric design and cinematic gameplay reminiscing to Prince of Persia. Eric Chahi later made his own developing company called Amazing Studios, where his next game, Heart of Darkness, is in development, which triples the amount of time to make Another World. While Heart of Darkness was in the making, more cinematic platformers were being created from the influence of Prince of Persia and Out of This World, with Delphine Software releasing Flashback a year after Out of This World. Blizzard made Blackthorn, and Oddworld Inhabitants created the Oddworld series, and more. Since it's so simple to identify 2D platformers, how can you tell the difference between traditional 2D platformer from a cinematic platformer? Well, this is what this episode of Video Game Genres is about, to help our viewers to tell the difference between game genres. While traditional platform games are all making high and long jumps, moving fast as you can, and so many stuff that defies the laws of physics, cinematic platformers, however, like I said, is a subgenre that distinct from typical platform games in that they focus on fluid, lifelike movements without the exaggerated physics found in almost every platform game. In other words, making jumps and leaps are more realistic, and there are consequences when landing on long falls, aka death. Defeating enemies should also be realistic by using weapons or any possible physical attacks, and everything else that isn't unrealistic as jumping on enemies' heads. Well, except for the Oddworld games, where you can't harm your enemies except when Abe is possessing one enemy at a time. Also, the way your character moves should also be realistic than how other platform games moves their characters. Basically, your character makes lifelike movements. When walking, they make step-by-step jump walks. When pressing down the left or right button, and pressing and holding a certain button to make them sprint, for running away, and or making long jumps, which creates realism within the animation. Speaking of which, what gives these games the title Cinematic Platformer is the design. The majority of these games, since Prince of Persia's release, has very atmospheric and well-crafted design, and top it all down is how interactive the character is to everything surrounding him or her. You can activate puzzles, turn on switches, grab on ledges, make traps, bump on walls, and so much more that makes the game feel very lively. Developers who has made cinematic platformers knows that it's not easy to make one compared to making mainstream games where they have to put as much realism as they possibly can. They must need all the time they need to make a cinematic platformer and use the best technology and make the best animation to make the game feel at all atmospheric and cinematic for gamers. That's why it took Eric Chaheed a very long time to develop Heart of Darkness for the PC and PS1, because they needed to make every part of the game interactive as possible in order to make it cinematic if not real. Also, depending on what enemy you encounter, you won't get hurt or immediately die by simply making your character touch an enemy. You can go past through them, but beware of the weapon they wield, which is used to kill you. Speaking of killing, cinematic platformers are never known for being easy. These 2D platformers has more trial and error than any other traditional 2D platformer. When I said almost everything surrounding the character is interactive, I did not say that lightly, because almost anything can kill you. Since these games tend to feature characters with ordinary human abilities and weaknesses, they often consider quite difficult, involving a great deal of trial and error. From traps where you have to time yourself in order to get past through, to enemies trying to kill you, to the times of having some of the most unexpected things that can cause you to die, which makes the intensity for these games very high. For Blackthorn and Prince of Persia, the character has a health bar, but for Oddworld, Out of This World, and Heart of Darkness, they don't have a health bar, meaning that they can have instant deaths. And to make it a more cinematic experience is how your character dies, as the developers make sure that the way your character dies fits the cause of death. It's not like Mario when he touches a booby trap or a Goopa, he automatically falls off the screen. These deaths are just brutal, well crafted, and creative at the same time. And for some cinematic platformers that got an E rating, does not deserve it because it is too graphic for younger viewers. But keep in mind that since the subgenre is most known for having trial and error, some of the hardest games of the subgenre should have infinite continues, otherwise the game will be close to unbeatable. Since there's so many dangerous obstacles in these games that causes great trial and error, checkpoints should be made in few and far between in order to make the game at all fair for the player. What makes all 2D platformers at all challenging is that you'll never know what's in front of your character because you can only see what's on the screen and there are no camera control. And cinematic platformers are no exception, because when you get from one screen to the next, you'll never know what to expect, which puts even more great deal of trial and error in these situations. I'm tempted to say that cinematic platformers are not side-scrollers, but rather multi-screen stages that do not side-scroll, like Pitfall, but there are cinematic platformers like Nosferatu and Limbo that are side-scrolling and still manages to keep the graphic depths and interaction. And before you ask, cinematic platformers are only 2D platformers because it wouldn't be fair for 3D games like Uncharted and Mirror's Edge to be called cinematic platformers because they're using 3D graphics to make it look cinematic. And other video games today uses high quality graphics, and just because they add platforming does not automatically make it a cinematic platformer. The reason why we call these 2D platformers cinematic platformers is because compared to traditional 2D platformers, these games aren't mindless flicks. They are to be taken seriously, show what 2D platformers are capable of, and finally give us a 2D platformer that feels mature, atmospheric, and so much more that you don't see in 2D platformers. But what keeps these games from being traditional 2D platformers? Because they keep the point A to be an issue of repetition by making the player to solve puzzles. And to be very interactive with your surroundings, puzzles are very welcome in this subgenre. There are puzzles in cinematic platformers that are very clever, hard to manage, and sometimes hard to guess. These puzzles requires thinking. At the same time, when there's a puzzle that has enemies involved trying to kill you, makes quick thinking a requirement in order to survive. Also trying to take care of your enemies as well as a puzzle unto itself, as you have once again a lot of trial and error. I never quite experienced a category of games like cinematic platformers, but unfortunately, there isn't that many out there. There are a couple of problems that has been kept from being popular in the mainstream. Like I said, it's very hard for developers to make a cinematic platformers because they need to make sure that every part of this game is interactive and well crafted, from the controls, sound effects, graphics, design, puzzles, enemies, interaction, and everything else that makes the presentation for each game great. Only the dedicated developers have the guts to put so much effort to these games. And since there's so many developers who are unsurprisingly cause stagnation in gaming, in other words, steal another idea from another successful game until the idea stops making money, cinematic platformers are not going to be many developers' interest because it's not really a popular thing. So why is that? Well, not that many cinematic platformers has ever had so much attention to critics and gamers alike, which couldn't match the same praise to other popular games, despite its uniqueness in each game in this subgenre. Most people refuse to accept these games for what it is and complain and alienate these games due to the fact that they have a great deal of trial and error, and they feel a lot different than normal 2D platformers. This frustrated many players, and some of them don't really like hard and challenging games and go for easier games just so they can be able to finish it. And that reaction is the reason why so many games these days are too easy. Cinematic platformers are indeed challenging, but if they were easy, will they be better? I don't think so, and in fact there are so many easy games nowadays that going back to cinematic platformers are worth the experience. These kinds of games are unfamiliar to many that it's not that popular to many people. That's the reason why Eric Chahi's Heart of Darkness took 6 years to make and it commercially failed, as well as other games in the subgenre. I find cinematic platformers itself probably the most underrated video game genre ever. What got me heavily interested in this subgenre to begin with is the designs in each and every one of these games, because they're so well crafted that I consider the majority of them a work of art. I'm not using that statement lightly like a video game fanboy sucking a huge cock to express his emotional attachment over a series. No, these games in this category is so immersive, lively, and so well crafted that made Roger Ebert's statement of saying games will never be art look subjective. I have been in art galleries and museums that paintings, sculptures, and other stuff that has been displayed there, not that many video games can match their artistic form. Heck, I don't even consider my top 10 favorite games of all time a work of art, but rather a work of gaming. So that is my credibility to judge what art is. However, there are games like cinematic platformers that actually does match its level of art, and they stand the test of time of being amazing to both play and to look at. I'm glad that indie gaming has finally carried the torch to this subgenre from being forever gone. Since Limbo has been very successful in 2010, I have a lot of anticipation to see more cinematic platformers in the future. Just playing these games, I have more appreciation for all the hard work put in these games, and ashamed that not that many of them are successful nor heavily discussed. Since this subgenre is so underappreciated with so many games in this category that deserves a lot of attention, it would be disappointing to see this video finish feeling undone. So this entire month of November, I'm going to be doing reviews on many of these games as much as I can, and then by the end of the month, I'll be posting up my top 10 cinematic platformers, showing you guys what is, in my opinion, the best of this subgenre. So take care, stay tuned, and I'll see you guys later. So if you like what you just saw, give a thumbs up, post a comment, and if you haven't already, please subscribe.